I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to Producing Fun. My guest this week is Gabe Barrett, podcaster, game designer, publisher, and creator of the Boardgame Design Lab. Long before I was bitten by the podcasting bug myself, I was a regular listener to Gabe Barrett's show. Until very recently, he's put out a podcast about game design every week since 2016. He's interviewed what seems like every game designer about almost every conceivable topic, in search for insights useful to the ever-growing audience of people that want to make games. In the process, he's built a huge community around his podcast, with 12,000 people in his Facebook group alone. As if he weren't busy enough, he's managed 10 Kickstarter projects in the same period, including a solo-only game that raised in excess of $65,000. In my view, Gabe is a true master of building a gaming community and gaining traction in a market by giving something back first. So I was very keen to understand more about his motivations, methods, and unique path to making multiple successful projects. Gabe is an absolute force of nature, and this conversation was enlightening in unexpected ways. From the incredible benefits of being in a small industry, to the unpredictable but practical ways that building your own crowd can help you succeed, and sage advice about becoming a cannon waiting to explode. This episode is brimming with useful insights for all kinds of creators. We join just as Gabe is telling me what it's like being out of the podcasting saddle.
And it just gets stronger and stronger. And what's funny, I haven't recorded actually since May, and we're in August right now. That's what's weird, because I had so many in the tank getting ready like for the end of the show, which is I knew was going to happen in like end of June, early July. But I had recorded so much, but I haven't recorded in a long time, James. So I'm really excited to be here, man. Really appreciate you asking me to be on the show. My life has been absolutely bananas lately. And so this is nice just to sit down and kind of feel back in my like comfort zone, really, of just chatting about gaming stuff over a podcast. This is excellent. Thank you, sir.
You really are more than welcome. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It was brilliant that you were able to be on the show, because your podcast was probably the very first podcast I actually listened to in games, and absolutely one of my favorite gaming listens. I think I discovered Ludology later, and that's got some great stuff on it as well. But yeah, I can think back to kind of a few episodes actually. You had a guy on who was really interesting from a marketing perspective. I remember I'm trying to remember the guy's name now. He's been on, I think you've maybe done a few episodes with him.
Andrew Lowen.
Yes, with Angels and Demons, the kind of...
Yeah, that game, Deliverance, is the game he's been working on for a while. Yeah,
that's the one. Yeah. And I remember that was brilliant because it really made me reassess online marketing and what it potentially could do in games. And that got me really, really intrigued. And I liked how, although you obviously tended to be more design focused, I really like the way that from quite early on, certainly from my perception anyway of it, that you were looking at games in the round very much.
Yeah. And that was the goal, especially as my personal like gaming journey like continued. Because honestly, I did 301 episodes. I didn't ever do a single episode that I was not excited about in some way. Right. And so the way you keep that going is to make sure you're always talking to people that are, one, interesting, and two, have something to say, like they're some kind of expert in some way, shape, form, or fashion, but also that I had a lot of questions about. And so that turned into, all right, let's talk about publishing. Let's talk about marketing. Let's talk about package design. And let's talk about all the many things, because my journey was going that direction. And so I had tons and tons of questions. And then I would just reach out to people that I personally wanted to talk to, that I thought, would be an interesting person to pick their brain. And then I could turn it into content at the same time. And so it just worked out really, really well. And so that's always my advice to people trying to make content, is be careful about like getting stuck doing the same thing over and over and over again, because eventually you're going to get tired and you're going to have to pivot and evolve and change. And so the best way to avoid that, where you're getting just kind of burnt out on the same old thing, is just go where your excitement leads. And I feel like if you have a community that's built up around you and what you're doing, there'll be most of them will be along for the ride. And that's definitely the case with board games and publishing as well. And so like just kind of go where the juice is, and see what happens.
I think that's great advice for almost every podcast. I think about some of the most successful ones in the world in any sphere are often built on people saying how much the reason they get people on is because they're very interested in the guests. I know that's something whenever people ask like Joe Rogan about his podcast, for example, which also I think is probably still the biggest by number listenership in the world, he talks very much about they're the people that he's genuinely wants to talk to. I think the same is true, yeah, of lots of different podcasts. And for me, it's really interesting that you touched upon something there that is very, very interesting when you said that it was actually a kind of excuse to talk to these people about precisely the subjects that are actually going to be really helpful. And I feel a little bit like one of the sort of secret benefits of doing a podcast, although it can be a lot of work, is that precisely that. Like, I feel like, oh my God, I've learned so much from so many people already that I've got to interview. And I think, whoa, I'm rather privileged here. I have all of these amazing people to talk to who've got some really interesting wisdom to impart. And that's been fantastic.
Yeah. It's always funny too, when people you have invited on the show send you an email and they'll say, "Hey, thanks for having me." Are you kidding? Like, I can't believe that you came on the show. Like, thank you. Like, I'm the one benefiting here. And then the people that obviously get to listen. And that was definitely the case early on, man. Like, I never, ever expected to do 300 episodes. I never expected it to turn into a community and this bigger thing than me. Like, there's 12,000 people in the Facebook group right now. That blows my mind. Like, I never thought that would happen. And I just thought, hey, I want to do a show about games and game design, and let's see what happens and see where it goes. And then all these people just kept accepting interviews, like Jamie Stegmeyer and like Matt Leacock and Rob Davio and all these folks. They were just like, "Yeah, I'd love to be on the show." It's like, are you kidding? Like, I'm nobody. I've literally done nothing that you would look at and go, "Oh yeah, that guy's worth talking to." And so it's just been amazing that that people will join you, and anybody thinking about making a podcast, creating content, whatever, you just got to put yourself out there. And you might be surprised, like I was, at how many people say yes, and then you're off to the races.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I think. Do you think that's partly because the industry is quite naturally open as well? I mean, it's also benefits maybe from being a bit smaller than some industries too.
I think it's because I'm so handsome, and people would look it up and be like, "Oh, that guy, he's so attractive. Let me talk to him."
I can confirm this is true. We're talking over Zoom right now.
Oh man, no, you're 100% on point. It's definitely because our industry is very tiny compared to video games, compared to movies, compared to books and novels and all that kind of stuff. And so, like, we basically have access to Steven Spielberg, effectively, right, in our industry. Like, we can reach out to the best creators, the best people in the industry. Like, we can reach out to them directly through Board Game Geek. Like, they all have an account, and you can direct message them easily, right? And they check it and they respond, right? And it's easy to find people's email addresses versus, Steven Spielberg. You would have to talk to like 17 people before you ever even got a text through to him, of 5 words, right? And so that is a huge benefit that we have. And you go to Gen Con and you can sit down and play a game. You can play the creation of the effective Steven Spielbergs of our industry, right? And it's nuts. And it's such a joy, right? It's such a privilege that we have, that this is the thing we're excited about. And unfortunately, that also means that our industry doesn't make near as much money as some of the other ones. Like, we're not in this gazillion-dollar space, which kind of makes content creation a little harder to make money off of. Versus like you can have a video game channel hit 1 million subscribers, and it's not that big a deal. Like, there's so many of them. But if you hit 1 million subscribers in the board game space, wow, like you're in the next level, like top 5 of channels, right? And so it's just, there's always sacrifices, there's give and take. But yeah, we're in a great space, man. I really enjoy it.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question about that, because that's one of the things I really wanted to ask you was, are you able to live from just the kind of Board Game Design Lab stuff, or it actually is what you do, because obviously you make loads of games as well on Kickstarter, kind of part of that too?
Oh, absolutely. It's all one big holistic thing, right? I think I could probably live off of BGDL, Board Game Design Lab stuff, if I really wanted to. Like, if I was putting out like 2 or 3 courses a year, if I was putting out 1 to 2 books a year, I probably could. I could probably like piece together a living off of just that. The problem with that is my brain doesn't work that way. My brain's like, ooh, shiny object over there all the time. And so I'm always like trying new things and whatever I'm excited about. And so that turns into a lot of board games and different types of games and solo games. And right now I'm doing a lot of narrative, like story driven, open world kind of game stuff, which is a lot of fun, but also crazy and huge. And so I kind of pieced together my income through a lot of different means. But also something else to think about is like, I would not, if I was going to write a book and I go online and I find a podcast or a course or something like that from someone who's teaching me about it, I want to know what they've written. Like, what have you done? Right. And so that's always been a thing with me is as I was making board game design content, I tried to be careful not to kind of get above my standing, I guess, and like not come out with a course and be like, hey, you should do game design like this, and this. And people are like, what games have you made? And I'm like, well, I've got some prototypes. Like, I just didn't want to do that. And so, like, even the books I've written, most of them have been reaching out to established designers, getting their ideas, getting their feedback, getting their answers to questions, and then like putting all of that together where I'm more of an editor than a writer. I've done a lot of writing, but it's a lot of like piecing things together from other people who you should listen to more than me. Right. And so that's always a challenge too. And so if I was only doing game design content, I don't feel like I would have near the credibility. Right. I also wouldn't have the stories. Like on the podcast, I wouldn't be able to go, okay, I'm working on this game. Here's what I'm dealing with. Here's an answer I found to a question. Here's something I'm still fighting through. Let me ask you about it. Like, I wouldn't have all the knowledge base to kind of pull from. And so that's always something to think about as well. Again, don't get too locked into one singular thing. And so, yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag as far as like all the different things I'm doing.
Yeah, almost you really had to make something and make several games, I guess, to be able to be in that position to kind of impart that knowledge. Even when you are editing and you're bringing those answers together, being able to contextualize all of that and bring it together is going to be much easier when you actually really understand the subject matter, because you've been there, you've done it.
Exactly.
I actually, on that note, that's something I really liked about the format to your book, and I can't remember which, the first one.
Mm-hmm. Boardgame Design Advice.
Yes, that one. With this idea of breaking it into stories from different designers, because that's also how one of my other favorite books in board game design, which is the Kobold board game design.
Yeah, that's an old school one.
That one, really old school one, but again, the format of multiple essays. And I thought that was so useful as a way of doing this, rather than trying to construct some kind of complete how-to guide, I think, in some ways, because I think that's a very good format, in the same way that, I've just managed to get my hands on a copy of the Building Blocks tabletop game mechanics by Isaac Shalev and Jeff Engelstein.
Yeah.
And again, it's a really useful and a slightly different way as a tool, because that's looking at building blocks, which on their own, actually, that's not going to be very useful, but it's a reference at the level of that thinking, rather than the level of the kind of more meta problem solving level that you find in your book, for example, is a very useful way to approach it. So I can see how for you that the podcast, creating all of these games, fit together quite organically, I guess, and to some extent you couldn't really pull them apart entirely.
Right. Everything informs everything else. Right. And it's just, and that's game design in general, honestly. Like the game I've been working on for the last 2.5 years in earnest, right, of really designing. And when I say 2.5, I don't mean, I started 2.5 years ago and then I left it for 6 months and I picked it back up for a couple months. I left literally 2.5 years of nearly daily working on this thing, right? It actually started 6 years ago when it was a totally different idea, and it was way bigger than I could have put my arms around. And so it was so overwhelming, I put it back on the shelf. And then many years later, because of learning, because of reading, because of all the podcast interviews and talking to people, I realized how to solve the overwhelming problem that I didn't know how to solve years earlier, and then picked it back up, right? And then kept going. And so it's really interesting how the creative space that we're in is so much built on the wealth of knowledge, right? Because you might work on something today that turns out to be a terrible idea. It's useless. You can't figure it out. It's probably not going to sell. Okay, fine. 5 years from now, you have a totally different thing you're working on. You go, wait, what did I do 5 years ago that I had? And you go find your old prototype, your old notebook, that you wrote some notes in, and you're like, that's the answer. And so it's cool how we're in a space where it's just like naturally organic, right? It's always changing, evolving, and you literally could reach back in the file from years and years ago and it turn into something that is pretty special today. And so it's interesting how it all works together.
Yeah, completely. And I think the inspiration can often come from many unlikely sources as well. And it feels like almost the more interesting the inspiration, or the more tangential to it all, right? Like in some ways, in my experience, some of the less interesting games I've seen, certainly as prototypes, have often come from places of someone saying, well, I just want to kind of abstractly do some stuff rather than, oh, there's some particular thematic inspiration or some need to solve a very particular problem. And one of the things that makes me immediately look at kind of your career there in interesting ways, this recent game that you've done, this trio of solo games. Because one of the things that's been really interesting looking back through your Kickstarters is that you've done a lot of projects that are really quite unusual. They're for example, lots of solo projects. The idea of going, right, we'll do a fundraising of a trio of just solo games. I would have thought from the outside, gone, well, okay, we've got a creator here who's primarily known more for the broader business of bringing knowledge and helping people learn, understand about games. You're going to do something so focused as that. I always think, oh, that's not going to raise any money. And then I look on Kickstarter and I was looking at the page and I'm like, $67,000 from that. And so I'm always like interested to know, well, where did the inspiration, for example, to that come from? Because it seems like quite a bit of a left field choice.
Yeah. So one thing I tell people all the time is create where you are. And at the time, I was in Honduras and I had lost my main gaming buddy. He had left. We were working out of school. I was teaching English. He was teaching chemistry. He had moved back to the States. And so the main guy that I played games with, that I played prototypes with, he was excellent at like developing and helping me like answer questions and figure things out. He was gone. And so it was just me. And I was like, well, if it's just going to be me, and my wife, usually would play games, but she was super busy. I've got 4 kids. Like she had a lot going on.
Okay.
Yeah. And so late at night, it'd be like 10 o'clock. I'd be like, hey, you want to play a game? She's like, I'm going to bed. I understand. And so I just started working on solo games because that's kind of what my life was like. And then especially because of the pandemic and you couldn't go out and all that. And so that's a lot of ways how it started. It was just like my life is in this situation where solo games make a lot more sense and they're a lot easier to play test and design because I'm by myself. And so that's where it all started. And then with one of those games, a guy named Joe Clipful, he designed what's called the Hand of Destiny. And he knew I was working on solo games. I had already published several. And he reached out and he's like, hey, I got this game. Actually, it was on a podcast. I interviewed him. And he was telling me about the game. And then after the interview, I was like, you've got to send me a prototype. I think that might be a game I might be interested in publishing. And he did. And it was excellent. It's this game you play in your hand. And, it's kind of like Palm Island, but a dungeon crawl, basically. And it's a lot of fun. And so that was another thing that the podcast helped out with. Either I was able to open the door to places that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise because I had relationships. But then also people were able to open the door in with me because now we have a relationship, right? Where they would say, hey, I'm working on this thing. And I go, oh, let me introduce you to whoever. I think they could help you. I think they might be interested in publishing a game like that. They're in your area. You should play test together, whatever. And so that's another thing, just kind of putting yourself out there, and relationships turn into good things.
What extent do you think being in Honduras influenced the podcast? Because I can see how, particularly in the situation you're in, to some extent, in the middle of the pandemic, everyone's in that same situation. It's really hard to be able to play games with people, unless you're doing it on things like Tabletop Simulator, which personally I always found is like never quite the same.
Yeah, it takes forever.
Right? It takes forever. It's like, oh, move, click something, grab it. Oh, it makes this otherwise quite fluid experience of a tabletop game quite painful at times. What impact did that have doing the podcast there? Because it strikes me that might have presented some challenges.
Oh, of course. I mean, I was there for a little less than 8 years. And so basically the entire time I was doing the podcast. And actually, so I got into game design in my early 20s, but just as a hobby, just something every now and then I would have an idea and I would write some notes and it would turn into like a complete mess and it would be awful. And I'd be like, who cares? And I would leave and I would come back and leave and come back, whatever. When I was in Honduras, I started listening to podcasts. I was listening to the Plaid Hat Games podcast. I was listening to Ludology. I was listening to a lot of them. And I just got more and more into game design. And I was working at an orphanage down there for a while. And my schedule was crazy. It was 3 weeks on, 1 day off. And I was just losing my mind, right? Because I was working 6 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. So 12 hours a day, 3 weeks straight. And just dealing with kids all day long, right? And these are not like typical kids. These are kids coming out of very, very broken situations. And so it was just very, very demanding of all my mental energy, my bandwidth, my spiritual bandwidth. Everything was just poured out all day. And so I started really leaning into game design as a way to escape and just kind of have a way to like get my brain off of reality and go mess around with some game idea and some problem I'm trying to solve, some mechanism to make this theme come to life, whatever. And then out of that, I was like, well, I really want to kind of get more into the industry. Like, what does it look like to lean into this? And it was around the same time my wife and I, our family, we had left the orphanage. We were working with an organization to help kids transition out of orphanages and kind of get real world skills and learn how to get jobs and go to college and stuff like that. And we were working with that organization. And then I had more time. I wasn't working 3 weeks on, 1 day off, 12 hours a day. And so it was like, okay, what if I created a YouTube channel? It's like, well, I don't think there's no game stores in Honduras. It's not like I'm going to go review board games. And then I was just trying to like think through what I want to do. I was like, what if I created a podcast? I was like, okay. And I just moved to a place that had a decent enough internet connection where I could do that. Right. And there was no video really. It was a lot of audio stuff, and power would go out randomly because reasons, and the internet connection would be awful sometimes. And so it all started there. Right. And created a lot of challenges, but yeah, it's just kind of crazy. Again, I never expected it to take off. I literally sent, I think, like 12 emails out early on. And I said, hey, I was sending out to different people I thought would be really cool to have on the show, and people way above my pay grade. And I was like, hey, I'm starting the show. This is what it's about. I'd love to have you on, on for an interview to talk about this topic. And I think 10 out of 12 said yes. It was just like, okay, I guess we're doing this. It's like, I thought maybe one, maybe I could get one of those, and then 10 out of 12. And so it's just been.
Hang on. So you'd sent these out before you'd done your first episode, right?
Yep.
So you didn't really even know if you actually even really enjoyed the process at this point.
No clue. I going on a whim and a hope. And daggum Jamie Stegmeyer was the first person to say yes. He was on there for the first show. And it just, and I think that's another thing. That's a good point. I never thought about this. Him being my first guest probably set me up to continue doing it, because it was so much fun, and he was so cool to talk to and so engaging. And he not only had good answers, but he also came back with good questions and put things back on me. And so that was just a really fun first episode. And then you get done, you go, okay, I think I can do this. Can I do it for a long, long time? I don't know, but I can at least do it for the other 9 people who've already said yes. And then we'll just see what happens. And as we were talking about before we hit record, like the average podcast doesn't make it past 8 episodes. So if you can get to 9, you're already in like the top echelon percentage wise of like shows that exist. And so right from the get-go, I already had 9 episodes. I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. And then it just became scheduling and like staying consistent and making sure that a show came out every single Wednesday. And it did for 300 Wednesdays in a row. So it was, a lot of fun, man.
What year was that? The first one then?
2016.
So 2016. So actually already by that point, it's not like Jamie Stegmeyer wasn't already a pretty big name, right? Like,
he was somebody.
Right? Isn't that after Scythe came out, right? Like, or about that time?
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, fantastic. I mean, again, as you said, how awesome is it that we live in an industry where that's a possibility, right? That someone as kind of big as him. I mean, famously, he's friendly. And whenever I've spoken to him on like social media or chats, he's always brilliant. So at some point, I need to invite him on, because I would love to have him as a guest on Producing Fun to talk about things.
He is the best. Like, he's the best of us as far as people in this industry. Like, it doesn't get any better than him. He's thoughtful. He's empathetic. He's engaging. He's kind. He's charismatic. Like, if we were going to have a person to go on the Joe Rogan podcast and represent all of us, I would elect him to go and chat. And so, yeah, he's awesome.
Well, yeah, he's a great ambassador, isn't he, for the entire industry
in
that sense?
Really
because he manages to fuse being such a great guy, but also so successful financially as well. Like, if I look at how successful Stonemaier have been at making things that people really love at scale and turning over tens of millions of dollars, yeah, that's a kind of pretty unique achievement.
Yeah, and he's brought so many new folks into the hobby. Wingspan did it. Scythe has done it. Like, so many people, they see that thing and they go, "Ooh, that looks interesting." And then, next thing you know, they bought 100 other games. And so we all benefit as publishers and as people in the industry from the work he's done. And there's a lot of other publishers out there too that have done such a great job of bringing in new people. And then the rising tide lifts us all up. So.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? I think that's something that's very much not a zero-sum game, which explains why, I guess, these podcasts, if you're persistent, you are as energetic as you are with guests, keeping everyone, keeping the thing moving all the time, can actually be very successful, because actually people are quite happy to share knowledge, to explore how to make things better, right? They're not like everything's a trade secret, we're going to be super guarded about it. And certainly in my experience, most of the people I meet who tend to have that more very trade secret orientated approach actually don't tend to be that successful in the game industry either, because I think they're not learning from other people either, and just sharing it is more valuable than trying to hoard the knowledge like it's sort of treasure or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I learned a long time ago was it's better to be a ladder builder than a ladder climber. And you end up in a much better place when you try to build ladders for other people than just constantly like trying to climb it yourself and keep them down and make sure you're ahead and push them down with your foot while you're going up, whatever. And people see that and they reciprocate. There's a lot of kindness, but also we are privileged that we're in a industry that people aren't just going to buy one thing. So if I'm selling cars and I work at a Toyota dealership, I need to sell somebody a Toyota, because if they go buy a Honda, they're not going to go buy a Toyota the next day. It's not like they're not going to buy another car for like 3 to 7 years, maybe 10, maybe 15. So like I have to make sure that my company is the one you buy. With board games, it's the complete opposite. If I can get you to buy my game and it's good and you enjoy it, you're going to go, I want more of these today. And you're going to go buy more. And you're not, maybe hopefully you're going to buy more from me, but also you're going to go out and find other games that you like. And you're going to, your taste is going to change. You're going to get to a deeper, where you don't want to go like heavier Euro, or maybe you've got some kids that come along. You're like, okay, let's get a bunch of family games. And so it makes sense for us to work together because we all benefit, right? Bringing more people in makes us all more money, and we get to all make more cool projects and cool games and have cooler licensed IPs and stuff like that. So it just makes sense.
Do you think that's partly the property of the fact that, I mean, generally, maybe unlike some segments of the market, it's one in which you have people who are, by their nature, interested in such a wide variety of things. They're going to be from a wide variety of publishers. If I think about compared to adjacent stuff, like, for example, let's take Warhammer, for example, Games Workshop. When people tend to buy into that, they tend to buy into that company's products like very entirely. Or the same thing with TCGs, right? Like Magic the Gathering as well. It's like they get into Magic the Gathering, and they're much more likely the general population to also be interested in board games, but they're probably not likely to collect all the TCGs because they decide that's my jam. They only buy like a huge pile of Honda Civics. I've got no other way to compare it, really. But with your analogy,
no, I think you're dead on.
Yeah,
I think you're exactly right, because if I'm going to do Warhammer, then I'm not going to do another miniatures based war game. Like one, it's too expensive, but two, it's a lot of rules. It's a lot to learn. There's a whole system to figure out versus, all right, I'm going to learn 5 different systems. Like, no, it's just too much. And also your community typically is surrounding that one specific game, those armies, the way the point system works, the way the movement and all that. Like that's the vocabulary, that's the jargon you're using around that one game. Same with Magic, right? If I'm playing Magic a lot, I'm probably not going to go out and spend more money on a different TCG, maybe a living card game, but probably not a TCG, because I'm already invested. I've already got my community. I'm already going to tournaments, whatever. Like that's where my focus is. Whereas board games, it's just not like that, right? I don't buy one game from a company and go, yep, this is my company. This is all I'm ever going to play is these games. One, because so many companies are making similar games, right? You can go out and find very similar, like scratch the same kind of itch games from tons of different places. But two, typically we just don't get into the hobby in that mode like you do with wargaming or collectible card games. And so I think my Toyota dealership analogy stands firm right there, because if someone buys Magic, that's it. And so if I'm the Magic seller, I'm trying to get them on that one thing, because then I'm going to make more money versus them, spreading things out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that makes me think about how you go about then your strategy for selling things as your business on it's really interesting, because when I think about this, I know you as Gabe and as the Boardgame Design Lab. I don't think of you as a publishing brand exactly, even though you've published a lot of stuff. So there's also something really interesting is at the same time, it feels like there's kind of a bit of a family resemblance between a lot of your games, and not just because you've done maybe quite a few more solo and puzzle things. Because if I think back to some of the slightly earlier products like Final Flick Tier, for example, like that's really different, it seems, to what you've been doing recently. It's not like Button Shy or something like that, where it's just like so completely perfectly like targeted at a very precise kind of experience that's very, very narrow in what it's trying to achieve, and just trying to do that one very narrow slice very well. Is there a kind of broad brand thinking to what you're doing? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, so early on, it was literally, what am I excited about? And let's make that game. And that's, fine.
Why not? I think we're all like that, right?
But from a business standpoint,
Yeah, especially at the beginning.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and pitching games to a bunch of different companies, that works really well because then you can go out to different people that design and publish different things for different player counts and different themes on it, and it works out really well. But when you're doing it yourself, and that's one thing I've just kind of learned in my adventure here, is you do want to find your people, right? Who is your audience? And if you keep doing things that are very, very different, people aren't really going to know who you are. Like, what are you doing? Right? It's gonna be confusing. And if you confuse people, if you confuse, you lose, is a good old marketing term. And so it's something to be aware of. And as my journey has kind of continued, that's why I've gotten more and more into, okay, I make solo games. Sometimes I'll make a 2-player, like a 1 to 2-player thing, but I'm not going to go out. You're not going to see 3-player games from me. Now, maybe a passion project one day down the road of some game I've really just wanted to bring to life. But typically it's 1 to 2 players, very thematic. I typically hire the same artists and graphic designers for my games. So if you see one, you're like, oh, that's from Barrett Publishing, right? Look at, what I mean? It's almost like Coca-Cola. Like if you see the colors, like the red and the white, you see that swirl, you don't have to see Coca-Cola, it's them. And so that's another thing I've really thought about is using similar artists to really make things similar, I guess is a good way to put it. That way, when someone sees it on Kickstarter, or they see it on a shelf somewhere, they know where it's from. They know it's one of my things, even if they don't see the name on the box or anything like that. And so I think that's something to think about from a product standpoint. And now a lot of companies, they produce a ton of stuff, CMON and WizKids and stuff like that. Like you're not going to hire the same artist. You're not going to have the same style for everything. And that's, of course. But if you're an indie publisher, you're doing, just a couple, 1 to 3 projects a year, like I do, then it's something to think about. Because one, the artists you hire they have enough bandwidth probably to work on that many projects in a year. They probably would like the consistent work as well, not have to wonder where am I going to get my paycheck next month. And so if you can kind of keep them hired on and keep them working on stuff, that's good. But also it just kind of keeps your brand similar enough where people see it and they go, oh, okay, yeah. I bet this is something I would like because I liked the last one that was like this. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's notable to me that when I looked at the Realm of Shadows, particularly, I thought, oh, that red and white made me think of the red and white in your Boardgame Design Lab logo. Was that deliberate, or is that more?
No, that was not. That was I just told the artist, hey, I want black, white, and red, and literally that's what he came up with, and I was like, hey, that works out. And that's another thing: hire really good people that are better than you at things, and because Jorge, he does a lot of my cover art. And he is phenomenal, like just a wonderful artist, one of the best I've ever seen, let alone worked with. And so, yeah, his guy was just like, hey, here's what I'm thinking. You run with that. And then that's what he came up with. And it was excellent.
I mean, yeah, I'm very impressed by the art execution on these things. It always looks, the pages look really great on Kickstarter, and they have that. I wonder then how much of your customer base overlaps with that incredible audience that you've been able to build out for the show, people who just want to learn about how to make games. Is it quite a strong overlap, or is it actually not as much as you'd expect? This is what I'm really curious about when I think about people's different approaches to marketing. I've met some people who say, I don't do any specific community building at all. I focus purely on the product, and then I pay for an absolute mega ton of ads and I just dump money into a Facebook, Google ad machine, and then massive Kickstarter fundraisers pop out, and they do like no social media at all. And then I know other people who are like, no, it's all about the community. And in some ways, it feels like, you would be one of the biggest figures of advocates of what incredible things can be done with communities. So yeah, I'd like to know more about that if you can share.
Yeah. So as far as like the overlap of my folks, it's an interesting hybrid. So when you're designing solo games, you're losing the majority of the market right off the bat, right? The vast majority of people don't care. Like they're not playing a solo game. They play games because they want to go to game night. They have a whole bunch of friends, or they've got their spouse or whatever. Like they're playing games to interact with other human beings. And that's amazing. And I love that. I prefer at the moment to design and play solo games. And so from the get-go, I'm already being like, all right, 90% of y'all have fun. And so there's that. If I was going to really step back and do this purely from a business standpoint, I would design a game about designing board games and manufacturing board games. Like I would lean into this whole thing. And I even played around with that and I just couldn't get it to work. I tried that, but I also wasn't super excited about it. I was like, I don't know. This feels like I'm just trying to make money, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But there were so many other things I was excited about that I was like really passionate about and like wanted to bring to life. I was like, I'll just, I don't do something else. I'll see if I can get some ads or sponsors or something if I'm going to just try to make some money off this. So there was that. So, but it's interesting overlap because I every single campaign I run, I will receive messages from people that they say, "Hey, just want to let you know this game is not for me. I'm not a solo gamer. You know, I don't like the theme. I don't like the mechanism, whatever. But I really appreciate all the content you've put out. I really love the podcast. I've gotten a lot of value out of the show. I've got a lot of value out of the community. And so I'm going to support you because of that. And I'm going to send it to my brother, my cousin, whatever, because I think they'll really like it. Or they'll just throw $1 in as a support, right? Just to say, hey, I don't like this. I don't care. I don't want to be in the pledge manager, but here's a few bucks. And so there's that, right? Where people, they want to give back, even though they don't want the product, they want to basically donate to the cause. And I appreciate that, right? So there's that. But then there's also the overlap, not of people buying stuff, but of people wanting to help, right? Like so many people in the community will reach out and go, hey, it's not really my kind of game, but I would love to edit the rule book, like proofread the rule book. And sure, I'll send them a link. Like, hey, throw some comments on there, And I've had people reach out and say that they were trying to get into rule book editing or proofreading or something like that. Would I be willing to let them do it? And then I'll put their name in the rule book at the end as the person who did it. And then they can point to that and go, hey, I'm working on getting, turning this into a job. And these are the rule books I've worked on. My name's in the back. Like, oh, okay. Yeah, I'd love to help with that. Now most of the time when people reach out with services and they're really good, I pay them. I feel weird about just doing stuff for free. And so, but that's also led to like my graphic designer, a guy named Drew, who has worked on almost every single one of my projects. He reached out to me years ago as a guy trying to get into the industry. He's a phenomenal graphic designer, but he was working in insurance. Like he builds insurance websites. Not exactly a super riveting creative field. Right?
Yeah, like compared to being able to work in games.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he reached out and he's like, hey, this is what I want to do. Do you have any prototypes that I could just like work on the graphic design and just send those back and just, trying to get, he was just trying to get better, just trying to get into the industry, trying to learn. And so, I've got people send me stuff like that all the time. I don't put a lot of like expectation. I don't put a lot of necessarily hope that they're going to be amazing. So I was like, sure, man, I was working on like this little like 1v1 Street Fighter combat game at the time. I sent him the ideas and sent him kind of like what I was looking for, card layout, stuff like that. And what he sent back was phenomenal. Like it was so good. And I sent him an email. I was like, hey man, I've got this other project I'm going to publish. Like it's going to be a real thing, not just a prototype. I need you to work on that. Like you were hired if you want the job. And so that was another just excellent thing that came out of the show, right? Came out of a person that heard the podcast and was like, okay, I want to be part of this in some way. And then he's worked on, I don't know, close to 10 projects. He did the layout for all the books. He's done the graphic design for the cards for all my hunted games. He did the graphic design for Realm of Shadows. He's done a lot of graphic design for Robomon that's about to be on Game Found. Like, again, they came out of the overlap of people in the community. And so there's more to it than just people supporting you financially. Obviously, it's helpful. Obviously, it's necessary to make money so that then you can make more content, right? But there's been so many amazing relationships that have come out of that as well. It's just been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thinking about it in an alternative way, because as you said, I can imagine that if you were making games that were much more broadly applicable to a very wide market of gamers, because the thing is, in reality, we said this is a small industry, and hobbyists are already a pretty small segment of that. And then solo hobbyists are an even more small segment. So you couldn't really rely on, even with, for example, that incredible Facebook group you've built out and that audience of people. And it's very interesting how when I put the call out for questions for this show, some guests I don't get many questions for, because I think they're people that I think are fascinating and have some really interesting, cool things to say, but they're maybe not quite as well known as other people. I think you've got the record for a number of listener questions. I put out one tweet earlier today, and immediately it's like, oh, what does he think about this? What's his favorite that? Like, so many people really wanted to ask you questions. So one of the things that I've not been brilliant at recently is making sure all of those listener questions get worked in. So today, I'm going to make sure that all of those questions, we're going to go through all of them, because they're actually all great questions as well. I think I'm very fortunate my followers have really interesting things to ask about as well. So so it would be really good to that. So yeah, so it makes total sense that actually there's the audience. For some people, a community strategy might be like, well, it's quite directly related to the subject area. But actually for you, it's like, well, actually, there's this tremendous value here of just being in this network of people who want to help each other out. And actually you end up getting lots of interesting inbounds that someone who was coming at it from a very more straightforwardly commercial perspective, where they're thinking purely of like ad spend because I can measure that and then just benchmark against outcomes, would have to go through a more conventional hiring and search process for that talent. You kind of benefited by all this inbound interest, which is, again, I guess that's another characteristic difference of that kind of approach. Because it really interests me at the moment, because I spend a lot of time thinking about the benefit that I can bring to the industry and things I can do, and trying to work out where I fit in that. Because I think some people, certainly you come across as being a naturally very extroverted person. Would that be fair to say that?
Yeah, it's weird. I am an introvert that presents as an extrovert. So like you put me on camera, you put me on stage, I am in my element. And then after it's done, I am exhausted. I got to go be by myself for a while. Y'all leave me alone. I got to recharge. And so it's interesting, but yeah, I definitely present extrovert.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because actually, if I think about that one even more deeply for a second, you are also passionate about creating solo games. And that wouldn't be a classic extrovert trait, really, would it? In terms of thinking from that perspective, maybe you'd be off making party games, perhaps things like that instead. So that's a really interesting point. But you've got that kind of natural energy and passion and ability to engage people in conversations, kind of perform as well. And I guess that means that fits quite naturally into what you're doing. And so that's the question I ask myself. And when I talk to people as well who are starting out, I'm like, well, sometimes it's worth maybe thinking a bit more deeply about what your unique skills are, because it might be that the cookie cutter approach wouldn't work for you, right? Like some people go, well, Jamie Stegmaier did a really successful series of blog posts from like 2013 about Kickstarter. So if I do a set of blog posts about Kickstarter, that will work for me. And it's sort of like, well, A, that was almost 10 years ago now. And B, that's not going to probably work for you because you're not Jamie Stegmaier. Only he is.
Yeah, I was watching a YouTube video the other day, and a guy was breaking down Mr. Beast and all his success. And he's like, all right, here's the deal. I'm going to try to break things down and deconstruct some things and share with you as YouTube creators what you can learn and how you can impact your channel. But right off the bat, I just want you to understand, you are not Mr. Beast. It's like, you're not that guy. Like, you're not going to be able to reach that level of success doing it the way he's done it, because he's already done it. Like you got to go find your own path, and your path, 99.9% chance, is not going to lead to the same success his path has led to. It is lightning in a bottle. It is so much based on luck and chance and just being in the right place at the right time, meeting the right person, whatever. You never know what kind of funding someone had that you have none, and they had all this extra, so they started the game a lap ahead. Like, you just never know, right? And so you just have to do your thing and try to help people along the way, hope for the best, and work really hard. Good things happen. But yeah, don't try to be somebody else. Just try to be the best version of you that you can.
Yeah, that's very much I think a very strong piece of advice in general. I think, and particularly, I think when you're trying to forge your own path on that. How do you advise if someone is wanting to at least do a podcast because they feel like they can contribute a bit there? What's the best way to listen to people?
The best advice for listening that I received was to realize that listening is not just waiting on your turn to talk. You're not just sitting there, if you're interviewing somebody, you're not just looking at your next question, because that's very obvious, right? When someone says something and the listener goes, oh, that deserves a follow-up. That deserves something to dive a little deeper. What does that mean? Whatever. And then you're just right on to the next question. You're not listening. And it's obvious to people, right? Versus you going, oh, that's an interesting angle. What have you thought about? Follow-up questions, because people can tell you're actually engaged. You're not just sitting there thinking about the next thing you're going to say that's going to get them or that's going to be super interesting. And people are going, oh, they're so smart. Like, you're actually literally listening. And it takes a lot of practice, man. And one thing I was really fortunate of, so I spent many years working for the church and doing a lot of like youth ministry and helping teenagers overcome obstacles, overcome problems. And teenagers are a mess. And so if you're not like really listening, you're going to miss some kind of like really important detail that they don't even think is important, right? They're just going to throw it out there and you're like, whoa, hold on. I think that's the heart of our issue. So there was that. And then I transitioned. I was working a lot with people that were experiencing homelessness in Atlanta. And I've been doing that for 12 years. And so much of that is you just sit down and maybe you're sharing a meal together, whatever, but you're just listening. Because what I found, especially in Atlanta, food was not scarce. There was too much food in a lot of ways. A lot of people in Atlanta eat too much that are on the street, and that's a scarcity, psychological scarcity, but it's not a literal scarcity of food. And so, when you're really getting into the actual needs, conversation was one of the biggest things. People were invisible. They would stand on the street corner and no one would ever make eye contact. People would walk by and pretend that they were just a shrub or a fire hydrant, like they're part of the scenery, right? They're not a real human. And to sit down and look somebody face to face, eye to eye, and go, "How's it going? How about the Falcons this year? I know they're terrible. They're always terrible. It's been raining a lot. You've been straight and dry, whatever." But you're just having a conversation, but then out of that, you can start picking little details and figuring out ways to actually help somebody, because what they really need is not food. It was the conversation to realize that they just didn't know where to go to get their social security card, to be able to get an ID, to be able to get a job, whatever it is, right? You start playing the clue. You're Sherlock Holmes. You're trying to figure out, okay, how do all these things fit together? But you can't do that if you don't really, truly, intently listen. And so I benefited greatly from coming out of those worlds where that was just what you had to do. And so then I get into this podcasting interview space. Well, I've already been doing this. I just haven't been doing it while recording. I haven't been doing it about game design, but it was the exact same skill set that I could bring over into it. And so that's another thing I tell people all the time is what are the skill sets you've picked up in your day job, in your teenage years, going to college, whatever, that then you can apply to this new world that we're living in that is so content driven, it's so story driven, TikTok driven, whatever. And how can you kind of use your preparation to then do some cool stuff now? And you didn't realize you were preparing. You didn't realize you spent 10 years learning how to do something that's going to help you now, but you did. And what are those things and how do you leverage it?
Yeah, and I guess that's quite difficult for people to do often because they tend to have a very categorical view of experience. So it's like, well, I was working, let's take the graphic designer, it'd be like, well, I work in insurance. And then, well, I don't know anything about games. But of course, actually, the real skills there, that's a job title. It's slightly easier to see it, but the real skills there overlap. I think for me, for example, used to run a newspaper. And I think that's been quite helpful in terms of thinking about editorial content, bringing kind of like a proposition together. It meant that plus my experience in software coming into making games was like, well, actually, a lot of the kind of project management, crafting a product, thinking about marketing are things that I've already done, even though this seems like a big
making clickable headlines.
Yeah, right. Like that's a good example of a very specific layer of that. So it sounds like when you're listening, then you're almost building up a little bit of a map of that person's life and who they are, which is, I guess, is that really what's prompting the interesting follow-up questions?
Yeah. So one thing I've learned over the years is that I don't think I've ever met an uninteresting person. Like even the people that are quote unquote boring, you just haven't found the right question. You haven't found the right line to get into. And I'll give an example. This was this is back in the spring. I was with a friend of mine, a guy that I was working with down in Honduras. We were working for a school and we were on a recruiting trip trying to recruit more teachers to come down to the school. And we were eating lunch with some of his family members. Like they invited us over. We were in the area and they're like, "Hey, you should come join us for lunch." Like, cool. So we went over there. And his brother-in-law on the surface is one of the most boring human beings you ever meet. He doesn't talk much. He's very quiet. You ask him a question, he's like, "Yes." And that's all you get. Like he just doesn't give you anything. And so it's like, okay. And so I looked at it, like, this is a challenge because I know there's a cool, interesting person in there somewhere. But there's, for whatever reason, he just doesn't present as anything that you would ever know. And so come to find out, he was working for a software company that worked with like law enforcement and the FBI and all sorts of stuff. And so he was really deep into like figuring out crimes based on like people's internet usage and stuff like that, and had written all this code for algorithms to like, so like you have a person that you think has committed a crime, but you're trying to like piece together the clues. And he basically is working on software that can go into people's Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff and like piece together stuff and then present it as a report in data form. So you're not having to spend, tens and tens and hundreds of hours doing it yourself. The software just boop, and then pulls stuff out, which is kind of scary in some ways. If we're going to be honest,
absolutely. Yeah.
A little bit freaky, but at the same time, super interesting. And I was just asking, like, how does this work and how does that work? And we got into like the ethics and the morals of it. And he was like super passionate about, like, we need to regulate this stuff. We got to make sure people aren't using this for evil. Like, he was like very on board with, we got to make sure there's like oversight and there's people like making sure these law enforcement agencies aren't, doing this just because they're mad at their girlfriend or something like that. And so he was on both sides of like, this is super helpful to society. To find a murderer is helpful to society, but then also to make sure that people aren't being abused with this technology is also super important. And so, but again, that turned into an incredible conversation with morals and ethics involved and new technology and all this stuff from a guy that on the surface seemed so boring. You just had to find the right question. And then, because once I figured out the questions to ask, I didn't have to talk anymore. Like, he was so passionate and so excited about it that the answers went from yes to yes, let me tell you about this and this and that. And the other thing we used to try, we used to do it this way and all that. Like, it turned into an amazing conversation. And so it just, everybody's got that. You just have to kind of get in there and find it.
Exactly. Like, from, as you said, one word answers to something quite so fascinating that I think is a subject which we're all interested and we're all actually have a stake in as well. Like, that's a really one of those critical technological questions. So obviously, as someone who's very passionate about talking to people, and you've got a great skill for finding out, so what's the real question? As you said, you've had to do that in lots of contexts, in different work, particularly youth work, leading up to this point. Why did you end the podcast?
That's a great question. One, I've learned from Barry Sanders, which was one of the all-time great football players in the NFL, to retire while you still got something left in the tank. Always leave people wanting more is something I've always thought about. And so that played into it, because I was not at a place where I was burnt out. I was not at a place where I was done, where I didn't think there were more interesting conversations to have. To be fair, I think I've talked about every topic you can imagine at this point. There's very few stones left unturned, although I'm sure I can find some. And we could get even more like very, very specific about topics, and we could do some episodes about that. But at the same time, I wanted to do something new. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to kind of change things up and try something else. And like I said, in that final episode, it's like, I don't know that this is the final episode, period. I might get the itch again, and a year from now, come back and let's do episode 302 and let's get, the show back on board, and we'll go up to 500. I don't know. But transitioning right now, I was transitioning back to the States. And so back in March, I moved back to Alabama. So I was in Honduras for 8 years. I moved back home, close to where I grew up in Alabama. And so that was a big transition. I knew a lot was going to be happening. I knew the job I was working at the school was going to be ending in July. So it just ended a couple of weeks ago. I knew the mission stuff I've been doing in Atlanta for 12 years with the homeless. I knew I was basically handing that off to a very good friend of mine who's going to keep it going and keep doing some really cool stuff. He's excited about it. I was passing it on to him. So I'm in this interesting place right now where I'm kind of establishing my entire life, and the podcast is just part of that. It's like, I'm gonna wipe the slate clean, and we're gonna do some new things. I want to lean into publishing. I've got this massive project I've been working on for a long time. I want to lean into that properly, not have my focus split on so many other things, and go, okay, we're gonna focus on this thing. And then I want to, as far as like content creation and that kind of thing, I'm still excited about that. I just want to try a different method. So I'm working right now on a YouTube channel, which I was hoping to launch this month, looking more like September. But I'm really excited about that. I've been working on videos and like learning how to edit and doing different things. And Robomon, this game we're working on, it's actually been great because I've been making videos for that and having to figure out, okay, how do you do these things? How do you set up the camera just right? And where do you put the microphone that is close enough to your face that the sound is good? And then figuring out editing and figuring out thumbnails and headlines, all that kind of stuff. So that's another thing. I'm really excited about learning all these new skills. And yeah, so that's just kind of where I'm at. It wasn't like any negative thing. It wasn't like, oh, I don't enjoy this or I'm tired of this. It was like, no, let's go try something else, something new. And now's the right time to do it.
Yeah. And do you think you'll still be doing some interviews on YouTube, or do you think it's going to be more kind of you're broadcasting out things, or is it going to be more about the game, like how to play type things? What kind of things can we expect from you in the future?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of a pivot where it's not just going to be board game design stuff. I'm trying to go like one step up the ladder, and let's talk about creativity. Right. Let's talk about scheduling. Let's talk about productivity. Let's talk about how to get the most out of a small amount of time, which definitely applies to game designers, but also writers, and movie makers and whoever, right? Really just trying to go, okay, if you are a creative person, the world needs your thing, right? Whatever the thing is in your head, we got to get it out of your head and out into the world, because I believe that it could help people in some way. Maybe it's just entertainment. Maybe your story is powerful enough to affect somebody who's also going through something traumatic that you went through, and you can kind of help them get on the other side of it, whatever it is, right? And so just trying to help creative people, and game designers will be able to fall right into that. Like, I don't think I'm going to do anything that they're like, oh, this doesn't apply to me. Like, we all need to learn how to be more disciplined with our creative time or whatever it is, right? And so that's another thing I'm just excited about, kind of exploring a bigger picture, right? And I've got all these ideas. I'm working on all these different scripts about creativity and stories and things like that. And it'll probably involve interviews, and I can, obviously reach out to people that I have really good relationships. I would love to have Peter C. Hayward and Jamie Stegmeyer, two of my favorite people that have been on my podcast. Like, let's sit down, let's do a YouTube interview, and let me cut it up, right? Let me make it more YouTube friendly and kind of have these different topics per video out of this, 30-minute conversation, as opposed to just the long form thing like a podcast would be, right? And so, yeah, lots of different ideas as far as that stuff goes.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds really great. Well, I'm sure particularly, Jamie must have a huge amount of balance. There's still quite a small team, aren't they, at Stonemaier? So
yeah.
Balancing all of that stuff out, I'm sure there's a lot of very valuable productivity tips there. Well, as promised, I want to make sure I always go through some of these listener questions, because we don't have all the time in the world, and I want to make sure.
Yeah, I'll try to stop talking so much.
At least, well, please don't apologize. It's absolutely fascinating, and I feel like it's classically one of those conversations where we could just keep talking forever, pretty much. So the first question I've got is from Leon Green, and his question is, what's your favorite board game mechanic and why? That sounds like a real stinker to me.
That is a hard question, man. It's not deck building. I don't know what it is. I could talk about deck building for days, about all the things I don't enjoy about it. It's like one of the main mechanisms that people love, and I'm just like, oh, another deck building game.
What is it about deck building that you're not keen on?
I think
some people love it. I must admit,
oh man,
I'm a pretty big fan.
Some people, that's all they buy. That's all they get, man. I had a friend in Honduras that was like that. Like, he would play any game as long as it had deck building, but nothing else. It's like, we are not going to be compatible as gaming friends. Star Realms, his favorite game in the world. I think partially in my brain, I am not overall good at engine building games in general, and deck builders are engine builders. I guess that's naturally what they are. Like, you're starting off with basically nothing, and you're over the course of the game trying to build up to have this engine where your cards all work together, and you've gotten rid of a bunch of bad cards and gotten all these cool cards in. I don't know. My brain just doesn't work that way. Yeah. And so I want to blow stuff up and shoot aliens with a shotgun and run around and throw some dice. And so I love anything that, like, give me a dice pool. As far as like mechanisms I love, give me a dice pool. Let me roll some dice. So just random chance. And then let me make some decisions. Right. Less so of like, I'm going to roll and see what happens. Like, more and more, I'm like, okay, let me have some control. But then also, I love dexterity style games. Like, give me a thematic game with some dexterity elements. Right, the game I created years ago, Hunted Mining Colony 415, 451, I don't remember the name of the game. Anyway, the Alien game that I made a long time ago. You've got these tokens, and you're tossing them into a box. There's an alien printed, and you have to land it on the alien to get a hit, right? And so, like, I literally win or lose based on my personal ability to toss these tokens. Like, it's all on me. It's like a sport,
right? Yeah,
right. It's like playing basketball. Like, you win or lose being able to throw the ball in the hoop. And there's no random chance. It's just like your skill. And so I love dexterity games in that way, because, like, I want to know that I won, not that the dice made me win, or vice versa. The dice made me lose. Like, no, I lost because I wasn't good enough. And so I love dice pools, and I love dexterity would be my answer to that.
Yeah. So I guess it's about designing a game with all of those elements in.
Almost as if I have.
Yeah. It's almost like you have.
With robot combat thrown in. Yeah.
So I've got another question from Tony Boydell, who asks, what game do you wish you designed that you haven't designed? As in a published game that you said, God, I wish I'd been the designer of that game.
Oh, Catan, just because I, be sitting on a fat stack of money right now. Same thing with Ticket to Ride or Monopoly.
Any of those, really.
Although I think the person who designed Monopoly never really got paid off of it, if I remember right.
Yes, I think that was. I certainly think the Landlord's Games. Maggie Liza, is that the name?
I know it was a lady that did it.
Yeah, who designed the Landlord's Game, and she didn't get anything for that. I think
ironic, isn't it? Ironic.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like, well, the whole thing, I think the whole point was it was an educational thing about like the dangers of property ownership.
Uh-huh.
And then it's like someone goes, it'd be a lot more fun if there were no tenants in this game and everyone was a landlord. Oh, great. Let's rewrite that. It becomes Monopoly.
I don't know if there's anything more ironic than that situation right there. Like, I don't think you could create anything like out of your head, like make it up, and it'd be more ridiculous than the way that situation played out. I don't think anybody would believe it if it wasn't true.
And then it goes on to become like the most successful board game of all time as well, which is just quite extraordinary.
It monopolizes the industry. Anyway, game I wish I had created. That is a good question. I don't know. Maybe Pandemic, because what I love about Pandemic and what I love about what Matt Leacock's doing, especially now, is who knew that system was so flexible, right? That you could not only do a game about the world ending because of disease, which not exactly a big time seller at the moment. Not a lot of people are like, yeah, let's play that. We all just lived it. No, thank you. But the fact that he's been able to turn it into a Cthulhu version and a Romans versus barbarians version and a stop the flooding of Scandinavia version and Cthulhu, Warcraft. I'm trying to think of all the different versions that are out now. Like, that system is so dynamic and so flexible. Like, I wish I could design, if not Pandemic itself, like just a system with that flexibility that you can keep coming back to it and you know it really well, you're comfortable in the system, but you can do a million things with it and they all sell, right? It's not just like random niche things, but it's things that are actually going to the market and selling copies. And so I think I'll go with that one.
Well, it's a bit like Catan, isn't it? It's become a kind of brand of itself, but it works because this isn't so flexible. I mean, also Pandemic Legacy Season 1 is like the first good legacy game that was created, really, and a really good one. And I think so, as you said, it shows itself to be an extraordinary system and very easy to apply to loads of things.
Yeah, like you said, like that game had a really cool story. Like, who knew that you could have a Pandemic game, but also have a really cool narrative underneath, and like have like these pivotal moments where people having emotional responses. Like, there's certain months of that game, you're like, oh my gosh, you just like sit back, you go, huh?
Yeah. Oh yeah. You suddenly felt a punch in the face, like, oh God, no, how are we going to deal with this challenge? Or we've lost, or something like that, right? Like, it definitely has that. Without giving any spoilers, it has some really like jaw drop moments, really, and in that game. But it's very impressive. So I guess on the same, somewhat similar theme, then, Arcana Prophetia, which I don't think is their real name, asks, what's Gabe's comfort game, the one he reaches out to without even realizing?
So it'd probably be something with my kids. It's probably,
I'm guessing it's not Pandemic.
Not Pandemic. Definitely not. Especially not in Honduras, man. Honduras was so locked down. Like, you can't imagine. Like, give an example. You could only leave your house once every 2 weeks based on your ID number. So if you were like the final digit in your number, so like I had my residency card and I think the last number was like 4. And so that would be Mondays were 1s, Tuesdays were 2s, Wednesdays 3, Thursday 4. So I could go out on a Thursday, but the following Thursday was for 8s. So I would have to wait another week and then I could go grocery shopping or go do whatever. And that was just one example of how just ridiculously locked down Honduras was. And so,
wow.
Yeah, I didn't really leave my house at all for a long time. And luckily the delivery industry in Honduras really started to boom. And so if you needed stuff, you could just, use an app, basically like Uber Eats, but it's called Ugo. And people would just bring you stuff. And so that worked out pretty well. And anyway, I don't want to play any Pandemic games, but
yeah, I feel the same way. We're actually, funnily enough, it was Christmas, New Year's Eve, 2019, that a friend of mine and we started playing Pandemic Legacy Season 1. I think we were playing it. We'd got to the 3rd or 4th game, and then by the time we could meet up again, I think it was going to be like the 20th of March, 2020, at just the point the UK first went into lockdown, and it was just like the example of just. Oh yeah, and then we came back to it a lot later, and to be honest, the shine had come off it somewhat as a game. I think particularly as I was going around just being like, oh, and then I quarantined this city. it didn't feel like
it was too real.
It was like
too soon, man.
Oh, I don't really feel like I'm having such fun anymore. Like, it was just one of those ones. So I could definitely imagine that's like the opposite. I think for a lot of people, very reasonably, that would be the opposite of the comfort game. I was very surprised when I read that there had been this boom in sales of Pandemic early in the pandemic. And I was like, You sure about that? You want to buy that game?
It was the hero fantasy, man. People wanting to be the hero and stop it and save the day. And then, a year and a half went by and we're still dealing with stuff. And like, I just want to play a party game.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's very astute. Yeah, I think you're right. Like in the beginning, it's more of like, hero, we could deal with
this.
Right.
2 weeks to stop the spread.
It was nice and exciting at the time.
A year into our 2-week anniversary, it's like,
just not quite so entertaining a prospect anymore playing that.
No. But back to your question.
Yes.
So there's a game my kids and I we play pretty regularly called the Fuzzies, and it is basically a new version of Jenga, where you have this tower, but there's all these little fuzzy balls that kind of stick together in really interesting ways. And you have to like pull a ball from the bottom or the middle and you have to stack it on top. And there's cards that tell you like what color to pick. And then there's like rules. If you knock one down, you have to like use your left hand, your off hand to pick up the next one. Like there's an interesting little like twist to it. So it's not just a Jenga remake, but it is so much fun. And I also love it because everybody's equal. Like most of the time when I play a game with my kids, I'm going to dominate them. I'm going to beat them. And I'm not going to feel bad about it. Like I'm going to let them know you're going to lose. Like one day you will beat me and you will know you earned it and it will be a good day, but it ain't today. And so that's most games. But that game, everybody's equal because I probably have lost that game more than I won because of just the nature of it, right? It's also dexterity, which I love. But the moment that I put the little ball on the tower and it's in the wrong place and the whole tower collapses, that moment where my kids go and they get so excited because dad lost and they win, it's just fun. And it takes like 5 minutes to play. And so if I just want to sit down, play a quick game before bed with my kids and just have some fun where they're just as likely to win as I am, I think that's the game I go to, the Fuzzies.
Yeah, the Fuzzies. Great. I must try it out sometime. It sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh, it's a ton of fun.
And then a last question today was from Jan Rustishauser, which I hope I pronounced correctly and haven't accidentally butchered their surname. And I think this is a very appropriate question to end on. What's the one thing you've learned interviewing other designers that you now use in your own design practice very consistently? And I'm guessing, based on our earlier conversation, that might actually be difficult because there could be a lot of things there.
There's a million things. And it's also situational. Like I would reach out to designers and publishers, throughout the history of the show that had already done things or had already had a good bit of success with something that I was in the moment working on, right? So early on when I'm trying to get into publishing, I reached out to a lot of publishers, a lot of people that did marketing, a lot of people that had run Kickstarter campaigns successfully, and to pick their brains about those things. Fulfillment. A guy named Toby came on the show and had just one of the most informational shows I've ever done. And it was all about shipping and how to save $1 on your shipping, because when you're shipping 5,000 copies, that's $5,000, right? And so that, there's so many, so it's kind of hard to say because it was very much in the moment situational. What I've learned overall, though, if I was just going to speak in general, is one thing to always remember is that your taste comes before your skill or before being good. And what I mean by that is you're going to know what's good long before you can create what's good. You can go, I'll give you an example from the art world. You can go to a museum of art and look at the paintings on the wall and go, that is amazing. Like that creates an emotional response in me. That is phenomenal. The line work, the paint, the color, everything is perfect. When long before you could sit down and even draw a stick figure. And so never forget that, because you're going to look at other people that are really good and have a lot of success. And you're going to have a tendency to compare yourself to them when it makes no sense, because you're not seeing the 10 years of stuff they threw in the trash. You're not seeing all the edits. You're not seeing the first drafts that were trash, they're awful. You're not seeing any of that. All you're seeing is the final product. It probably took a team of people to bring together. And you're looking at that, and then you're comparing it to your prototype and going, mine's not any good. And you're right. You're absolutely right. But just keep going, right? Their thing wasn't any good at 1.2. And so keep fighting, keep putting time in, keep putting the effort in, keep just trying to be the best version of you that you can. Stop comparing yourself to other people. It's a waste of time. You're not running a race against anybody else anyway. The race is with yourself. And the question is, can I be better today than I was yesterday? Right. And so realizing that thing that, that you're going to know what's good long before you can create what's good, but just keep going. Like, just don't give up, because all the people that we look at today as like the all-time greats, are really just a bunch of people that didn't stop. They kept working and they got better and they grew and they learned and they made a lot of mistakes and they figured things out along the way. And now we look at them and go, wow, they're amazing. Yeah, but it wasn't overnight, right? Like they were 10 years. It took 10 years to become an overnight success, you know, and it's one of those things. And I had a guy tell me one time to live like a loaded cannon, which is a really interesting concept, right? Where every day you're trying to do something to quote unquote load the cannon, right? That you're trying to be ready, right? You're gaining in knowledge, you're gaining in skill, you're figuring things out, you're overcoming obstacles and problems and you know, making mistakes and getting better, loading the cannon. And that way, when the light shows up, when the catalyst to light the fuse happens, boom, it was already loaded. The cannon was loaded the whole time, right? And you can apply that to a lot of things in life, but definitely with creativity, that you're constantly trying to figure out how to load the cannon. That way, when that quote unquote overnight success opportunity happens, it's a massive explosion, right? Because you're ready.
Yeah, I think that's some absolutely fantastic advice for anyone, because those things are nothing happens until suddenly it happens. And that's where you want to be ready for it, right? Absolutely. What brilliant advice. Be a loaded cannon. I like that a lot. So what can we look forward to coming soon from Gabe Barrett? What should we be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so Robomon is a kind of Pokemon, Mega Man inspired game I've been working on for a long time. If you like sleeping gods and this kind of like open world, go explore, do cool stuff, have some battles, you know, enjoy an interesting story narrative. I think it's a game you might like. It's 1 to 2 players. It's going to be on GameFound starting on August 22nd. It'll run through kind of mid September, and it has been overwhelming and a ton of fun to work on for the last 2.5 years. It's got another probably 8 to 9 months of you know, finishing it out after the campaign. But it's a huge project, man. Like, you want to talk about going to a new end of the spectrum. Like, I've historically been designing solo games that were about $20 and took you about 20 minutes to play. Now I've got a game that's on GameFound. It's gonna be $79, so massive change in price. But it's gonna take, it's like 30 hours of content, and you can sit down and play for 20 minutes if you want to. Like, I've set up the game where you can play for as short or as long as you want. You can dive right in, you can step right back out really, really easily. Setup takes about 2 minutes. Teardown takes about 3 minutes. Like, it's a very, very quick game to get to the table and play. And at the same time, it's got a lot. It's got a lot going on.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah.
You've suddenly gone from yes, you said like a 20-minute solo game to suddenly your own kind of version of Seventh Continent.
Yes, literally. I mean, it's very similar. It plays differently. It doesn't use cards. It uses this map book where you're turning the pages and you're going to different locations in this world. And you've got this adventure book full of stories and skill checks and combat and puzzles. And we've done a lot of like graphic design, like graphic novel kind of stuff. Like, a lot of the cutscenes, I think all the cutscenes are comic book pages. And so it's more than just sit down and read a block of text. It's like, no, here's a really cool visual as well, where you can kind of see the characters and you see them talking to each other and you see some like little Easter eggs going on in the background. And it's a massive undertaking, but I got a great team of people working on it with me. And again, it's just been a ton of fun. And another thing about working with a lot of people is you get to be surprised, right? So often when I'm working by myself, I am designing the surprises. Like, I am creating the thing, but I don't ever get to be surprised, right? I created it. But with this project, there's so much going on that I've had to hire other people to do, whether it's, you know, some of the writing, all of the art and whatnot. Like, I can't draw to save my life, the puzzle design, whatever. And so people will send me these things and it's like, oh man, like, I get to experience them for the first time, right? I get to figure out how to crack this puzzle for the first time. And so it's been a ton of fun to work on the project. And I hope other people will check it out and yeah, consider backing it. I think it's going to be kind of a new way to look at board games, in the same way Seventh Continent was. It's like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna try to put this game in a similar place where it's like, oh, that gives me some ideas. I can kind of inspire the next round of narrative story-driven game.
Fantastic. Gabe, that sounds absolutely excellent. I look very much forward to the Kickstarter campaign. I'm massively going to check that out. That sounds really interesting. The idea of cutscenes sounds super cool. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I knew this would be a good one, that we'd have a load of really great things to talk about, and it's been absolutely great.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. Again, it's good to get back. It's fun to get back into the behind the microphone, to dust the dust, knock the dust off my microphone. But it's been a lot of fun. Really appreciate you having me on the show.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.